Okay, Boker Tov, everybody. Good morning, Shavua Tov. Thank you all for coming. We have a packed house this morning for the last share of the season. I know you're all very, very disappointed, but I just picking out. So this will be the final Tzurba Marabanan share before the summer break. Next week is Yuzayin B'Tammuz, so it's actually Yudchet B'Tammuz, but that's the fast is deferred by a day, so we won't have a share next week, and then we'll resume again at some point. Probably in Chodesh Elul, so I'll let you know. But we'll have a little bit of a summer break, so it's a good time. Everybody has the books. You can all spend the next few weeks doing Chazara, and you'll come back as absolute experts in Hilchot Shabbat. Okay.
There's no class next week.
There is no class next week or for the summer. Okay. So okay, and our topic today, we're in the final share of volume 19. This is also a good opportunity to let you know that volume 22 is in the final stages of publication, and if anybody would like to sponsor, not the entire volume, but would like to sponsor one of the shiurim as a way of showing gratitude for the Tzurba Rabbanan, those sponsorship opportunities are available. You can come speak to me afterwards. Okay, so we're talking today about halachot related to the outdoors on Shabbat, which at first glance sounds like these are not going to be so relevant to us, but in fact they are very, very relevant, as we'll see. Now it's funny when you think about Hilchot Shabbat. So nowadays, when you ask people, you ask somebody in the street, what is Shabbat? What are the things you can do or can't do on Shabbat? Most of us immediately turn our attention to electricity and electronic devices and things like that you cannot use on Shabbat, and you can't turn on your phones, etc. And that is a fascinating discussion. We'll get to it in a later volume. What precisely is the prohibition of using electronic devices on Shabbat? Some may not be as clear-cut that it's forbidden, but it may not be as clear-cut as we think as to what it is and what the source is. But really, the classical melachot, when you think about it, the 39 melachot, things like watering plants, watering the ground, plowing, planting, etc., these are bona fide melachot Shabbat, melachot d'oraita. And as I say, they come up more often than you might realize, especially now coming into the summer and people going away and different things. There are quite a number of places where these do come up. So let's have a look. Page 299. 299 in the book. The first subject we talk about is watering plants. Okay, and again, it comes up in many places. We begin with a discussion in the Gemara Masechet Moed Katan. Masechet Moed Katan, source number 1, there is a machloket amoraim as follows. The Gemara says, Itmar, hamenachesh v'amashke mayim lazraim b'Shabbat. Somebody who weeds, which is not our topic for now, but somebody who waters plants, water seeds on Shabbat. So the question the Gemara here asks is Mishum Mai Matrinan Be. Okay, what do we warn him about? In other words, in the time when you have a Sanhedrin and when you have the punishments from the Torah that would be applied, one would only be punished in terms of if one had received prior warning. Warning means you know exactly what it is, what the malacha that you're about to transgress. So it's another way of saying essentially nowadays, not so much nafkamina of it, but the nafkamina will be understanding which malacha one is transgressing and what the parameters are. So if somebody who waters plants, again, it's axiomatic out to the Gemara, you may not water your plants on Shabbat, but which of the 39 melachot would you transgress were you to hypothetically do so? So there are two opinions. Rabbi Omer mishum choresh, Rav Yosef Omer mishum zoreh. Okay, we don't find in the list of 39 melachot a melacha of watering, but we do find a malacha of plowing, and we find a malacha of planting. And this is the machloket between Rabbi and Rav Yosef. When you water the plants, is this a derivative of plowing, or is it a derivative of planting? Why this one and why that one? So the Gemara explains. Amar Rabba, Kvatei Didi Mistabra. He says, my opinion makes sense. Why? Ma darko shel cholesh l'rpuyei ala, hainami merpuyei ala. Says, what is plowing? Plowing is, we spoke about it last week. We spoke about dragging very heavy objects, dragging tables across the ground, right? You're loosening the earth. You're loosening the ground. You're making it softer in part of the preparation for planting. But so by softening the ground is what plowing does. And he says, when you pour water, you are similarly softening the ground. Therefore, it belongs to this malacha. Rav Yosef says, on the other hand, Amar Rav Yosef, Kvatei Didi Mistabra, says, no, my opinion makes more sense. Why? Because He says, what it plant, you plant in order to sprout the seeds, make the plant grow forth. So too, that's exactly what you are doing. You are encouraging the planting, encouraging the growth by watering the plants. Okay, the conclusion of the Gemara, it's not so clear what the conclusion of the Gemara is. If you turn over the page, you'll see there is a discussion. Why do we have to say that it's one or the other? Maybe it's both. In other words, the Gemara leaves a distinct possibility that by watering plants, you are transgressing both plowing and planting. Now, this is going to be significant. Why? Because what happens if we have a situation whereby I am pouring water onto, not necessarily onto plants, but maybe onto the ground, where there is nothing which can grow, there's nothing which I can plant. Therefore, there would not be a violation of Zorea. But if I'm still softening the ground, then maybe it's a violation of Choresh. If I say that the conclusion is that this is only connected to the Malacha of Zorea, then that action would be permissible, and vice versa. So that's going to be important that we understand. So, again, the Gemara says, watering plants or pouring water on the ground, it's either Zorea, which is planting, or it's Choresh, which is plowing, or it's both. Okay, conclusion is somewhat unclear. So let's go to the Rishonim and see how the Rishonim paskin. The Rambam, in source number 2 on page 300, says the Rambam, Zorea koshu chayav, v'zomer ta'ilan, kadei sheyitzmach reize mein zorea, aval ha'mashke tzmachim v'ilanot b'Shabbat ha'reize toladat zorea. Somebody who waters plants and trees on Shabbat is a tolada of the melacha of zorea, of planting. V'chayav v'koshu. Okay, so there's no mention here of Choresh. The Rambam only mentions here the halacha of Zorea. And therefore, based on that, with similar logic, says the Or Zarua, source number 3, another one of the Rishonim. The Or Zarua says, Hashtal Rav Yosef, mutar lishpoch mayim al gabei karka she'eina Zorea. According to Rav Yosef, who says that the melacha here is Zorea, planting. So he says, according to that, if you would pour water on ground which is nothing is growing there and sown, right? It would seem that it's permitted. Okay, that's just skip to the next paragraph. It says Miu. He says, I hold that halacha will follow Rav Yosef, that it's only because of Zorea. And he brings a proof for it from the Yerushalmi. Okay, over the page 301 in the top. It says, in other words, he says, I hold that it's like Rav Yosef, and that's what the Rambam wrote as well. The Rambam, as well known, the Rambam doesn't write what his sources are, who he's paskening like, right? He just says what the halacha is, but it's clear from the Rambam that we learned that he's holding like Rav Yosef. In other words, a tremendous leniency comes out of this. He says, if you have unsown ground where there are no plants, you could go and you could pour you could pour water down there. Why would you want to pour water down there? We'll talk about it in a moment. But the most famous and the most common practical application of this halakha is if you are eating outside, let's say you have a kiddush or you have a sudah shlishit or whatever it is, it could be lunch, and you go and you wash your hands and do netilat yadayim. You know, once I was, quite recently, I was somewhere, I won't say where, but I was invited out for a sudah shlishit, and the people, it was a very, very nice summer day, so they were eating out in the garden. So they said, okay, it's time to wash. You know, nowadays everybody's very environmentally conscious. So they had all their plants in the corner, and they had so everybody went to wash, and they washed over the plants. That is a problem. That is you should not. Yeah, however environmentally conscious you are, that does not trump Shabbat. That's exactly what we're talking about. If you're pouring the water over, and this is the classic case we mentioned last week. We'll get into more details shortly, but we mentioned last week the classic case of Eino Mitkaven. Right? We said Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, when I perform an action, I'm not intending to perform an isur. According to Rabbi Shimon, that's what we call Eino Mitkaven, and that is allowed. However, the exception is what's called a psik reisha. Psik reisha means that the forbidden action will inevitably result. So if I am pouring water, why am I pouring water? Not because I want to wash the plants, but because I want to wash my hands. And it happens to be that underneath my hands there are plants. Okay, you can't say, you could say, well, it's a no mitkaven, I don't intend for it, but actually it's definitely going to happen. It's over the plants. Therefore, it's going to be forbidden. Here it's even worse because even to say no mitkaven, if it's your own plants, it's a particular issue, you're definitely interested. You're doing it in order towards the plants, so that would certainly be forbidden. There is no allowance for that.
Do you say something?
So it depends on the situation. Depends on the situation. Somebody asked me, I would definitely tell them that it's forbidden. That's the answer. Okay, so put it this way: if it was somebody that I knew or somebody in my own community, that would be one thing. This was whatever circumstances were what they were. Okay, so source number 4, we see here the Sefer Yereim. He says the following. He understands that what we've seen until now in the Rambam and the Or Zarua talk about watering only as being a Torah of Zorea and not of Choresh. So the Sefer Yereim learns differently. He says, "B'tchilat moed katan amorin amashke mayim nizraim chayav mishum mayim matrinan be Rav amar mishum Choresh Rav Yosef amar mishum Zorea umesik abaye dechayav mishum Choresh umishum Zorea." So he understands that in fact here it is a transgression of both Choresh and Zorea. And if that's the case, then whether there are plants there or not on the ground, it would still be forbidden to pour the water. So the Sharat Tziyun here in source number 5, Sharat Tziyun, remember, that is the Mishnah Brura. Right on the page of the Mishnah Brura, the Chavetz Chaim wrote the Mishnah Brura, which is the summary and the halacha based on the Shulchan Aruch. Next to the Mishnah Brura, he also has the Biur Halacha, which is sometimes things which are a little bit more involved and more detailed sugyas, and it goes into questions then. At the bottom of the page is the Sharat Tziyun, which is normally just the sources where it comes from. It's very interesting. Sometimes you look at the Sharat Tziyun, so he tells you who he's quoting, which Rishonim or which Achronim, Shulchan Aruch Harav, or this or that. And sometimes he just says Poskim or Achronim. So many times when the Sharat Tziyun writes Poskim Achronim, when he's referring to is the Sharat Tziyun, the Mishnah Brura. That's his a posek, of course, in his own right. But sometimes in the Sharat Tziyun at the bottom of the page, you'll see there's a more detailed discussion. Why he puts it over there and not in the Biur Halacha, I don't know. But that's the case over here. So in source number 5, he says like this: Ayen b'Or Zarua sh'da'ato ke'Rambam de'eino chayav rak mishum zoreh. Right, that was the first opinion we saw. There was just that it's just because of zoreh, just because of planting. V'katav sham de'lefi zeh b'karka she'eina zua af she'omer lachal shamut ala tilba mayim. Okay, so he says then, based on this, you could pour water over ground where there's something which is not planted, even though it's usually ground where you go and plant. Achen, so many other Rishonim and Achronim hold differently, which is what seems to be the conclusion of Abaye in the Gemara, which is that it's both Malachot, both Zorea and Choresh, and therefore he says, Lefi zeh, yesh lizaher gam b'karka she'eina zua im rak omedet lechalisha. Okay, so therefore the conclusion is, says the Sharat Tziyun, if you have ground which is going to be plowed or could be plowed, even if nothing's been planted there yet, you should still not pour water on because of these Rishonim. Now we get into the discussion about actually having a meal outside, and again, some of the poskim write that because this is such a difficult thing to avoid, better not to eat outside at all. Again, obviously nowadays things are different. Back in the day of the Rishonim, you talk about washing your hands, so you get a bucket of water from somewhere, you have to pour it out. Nowadays, everything we go inside, we have taps, we have sinks, we have all sorts of things. But he says like this, and this is something one has to be aware of. Obviously, if one goes to eat outside, on Sukkot, again, if you have your sukkah outside, and sometimes you're going to go and wash over there, it's also something to be aware of. Source number 6, says the Sefer Truma, at the top of page 302. Says the Sefer Truma, Omer ani davar regilut. Okay, this is something which is very, very common. This is something I have to say all the time. In every generation, every rabbi has their thing that they have to tell people, that people whatever are lax about. So this is in his day, seems to be this is what people were lax about. כי בקושי יש לאכול בשבת מקום שיש עשבים מחוברים כמו פרדס שרגילים לאכול בימות החמה. It says in the summer, everybody goes and eats outside. And this is a terrible thing. Why? והטעם לפי שאי אפשר שלא יביאו שם מים לרחוץ ידיים או לשתות או לרחוץ כלים, because they're going to go outside and they're going to bring water to wash their hands, water to wash the dishes, whatever it is. ושופכין מים על עשבים במזיד בשעת רחיצת ידיו, right? And you're pouring the water over your hands, you're pouring the water over the plants. בשעה שרוצה לשתות וצומחים העשבים, you're watering the plants. על ידי כך, ואינם מפסיק רשע, בשעה ששופך מים על עשבים, אי אפשר שלא יצמחו יותר. But don't tell me that you don't have this, you don't have intent for this. This is a psik reisha. You're pouring water. It's going over the vegetation. It's going to make it grow. It's in isur. All right. כי מלך לכאן ועובר משום משקה מים לזרעים. Therefore, that is going to be a problem. Shulchan Aruch brings this, source number 7. He says, האוכלים בגינות אסורים לטול ידיהם על עשבים שמשקים אותם. If you're going to eat outside, eat, okay. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't say you can't eat outside, but if you do, you have to be very, very careful where you wash your hands. אף על פי שאינם מכוונים פסיק רישא. And says the Rama, ולכן טוב לחמי שלא לאכול בגינות. Says the Rama, better to eat inside. אם משתמש שם עם מים, בקושי יש לזה שלא יפלו שם. Okay. By the way, this is one of the reasons as well, we find that it's a question that comes up. People ask, coming into the summer as well, ask about swimming on Shabbat. So Rabbi has a tshuva. I think he has about 10 different reasons why one cannot go swimming on Shabbat. But one of them, most famous one, is that you go out swimming in open water and you might come to build a raft. And everybody says, I've never built a raft when I swim. Why can't? So that's not the only reason why. But one of the reasons is that you walk out and the water's dripping and the water's dripping all over the grass, etc. This is why it's brought in some of the Rishonei Ashkenaz as there was a minhag, there was a gzerah not to bathe even in cold water on Shabbat, because people would go out and they bathe in the rivers, whatever. And one of the reasons, the other reasons as well, one of the reasons that you'll end up inadvertently or advertently pouring water onto the grass, etc. So that's another question which comes up here. Okay, so you can't pour water. Sefer Truma says, what about other liquids? If the problem is that I'm pouring water, it's going to be good for the grass. If there are other liquids, such as what's in Hebrew is called mei raglaim, which is urine, is that going to be permissible or prohibited as well? It's fascinating, by the way, how some of these questions come to life. Again, we always realize when we learn these halachot and as we go through just how much hygienic conditions and sanitary conditions have improved over the past few hundred years. And Baruch Hashem, we live in a time where we live. And again, these are not so relevant nowadays. Most people are not looking to go and relieve themselves outside. You go inside, you have a bathroom, etc. But there's actually an essay here. This question came up for one of the Avrechim on the Manigut Toranit program in Eretz Chemda, who write these essays at the back of the Shurim. So he was in Gaza for a number of months, and there you have all sorts of questions that come up. One of the questions that he discusses is when he needs to go and relieve oneself on Shabbat. The conditions are not. You don't have. You're out in the field, or you're out in the shetach, or you're out in home. You don't have running water, etc. Can you go? And if there's on the ground, on the grass, on the trees, etc. So is one allowed to urinate over the grass? Is that the same problem as pouring water? So the Sefer Truma says over here. He says, "Aval shari lashtin mayim al azraim val asavim." He says, no, this would be permitted. לפי שמי על רגליים עזים ושורפין את העשבים שהרים מעבירים אותם על הכתם כן חזקים ועזים. He says urine is not like water, it's corrosive, it's not good for the vegetation, and therefore that would be permitted. He says חן נמי יין מותר לשפוך על העשבים פרדס. Also pouring wine would be permitted as well, because that is also, he says, corrosive and strong, etc. That is the Sefer Truma. The Sefer Yereim disagrees. But the Shulchan Aruch paskins leniently over here. The Magen Avraham does say in source number 10, he says, we're not always sure, and therefore he says, he says, it's better not to pour any liquids over the grass, but nonetheless, here there is certainly what to be lenient about. The Mishnah Berurah as well says regarding wine and other liquids, one does not need to worry. But again, water is still going to be, that is a problem. Now, yeah.
I think that as much as you say that it's easier now, we have so many conveniences. And people are more learning. They're learning all these details and everything, right?
Yeah.
Something very, very crucial and important has been lost. And that is the spirit of Shabbos. I don't need to know, I do need to know these halachas. come up like you. But there's a spirit of Shabbos, and that's how Gladys and we raised our children. They would not be on scooters. They would not be on roller skates on Shabbos. And maybe the halacha is you could, with us it would be, it is not in the spirit of Shabbos. Zeu. And that's what kept us alive all these generations. It wasn't the minute details, because people weren't so learned. It was knowing and understanding what is Shabbos and transmitting it to your children. No, you are not wearing that shirt and those pants on Shabbos. It's not in the.
This is what Rabbi Wine spoke about yesterday. So I'm going to agree with you and disagree with you at the same time. I am a rabbi after all. So it's true that there is you're right. There's a certain Masorah and there's a certain atmosphere and there's a certain thing. But the question is, how do you define? How do you know? Who knows what the spirit of Shabbos is? Where that comes from? That comes from here. That comes from these minutiae and these details and these halachot. That is what defines the spirit of Shabbos ultimately. Because I'll give you an example. This isn't really our topic, but it's a fascinating discussion. So I'm happy to digress for a few moments. A Shabbos timer. Okay, by Shabbos timer, Shabbos clock, right? Sha'on Shabbat. By show of hands, how many people in this room use a Shabbos clock? Is there anybody here who doesn't use a Shabbos clock? Okay, so when the question goes, you all use Shabbos clock because the shul uses Shabbos clock. So everybody, there's no home today. There's no Shabbos observant home in the Jewish world that does not use a Sha'on Shabbat, whether it's for the lights or for the hot plate or for that, whatever. Okay, so let's go back a few decades, and the Shabbos clock is invented. And they ask Rav Moshe Feinstein, they say, can one use a Shabbos timer on Shabbat? And he says, no, it's not in the spirit of Shabbos. And there are all sorts of things that come around and people say, well, you could, this is the spirit, this is that. How do we know? So ultimately, again, we'll get to this in a future volume. And the truth is that this is a fascinating question, and it's a very, very challenging question, which we face all the time, because there are all sorts of new things, all sorts of automation, Shabbos lifts. Okay, everybody in this building uses a Shabbos lift. Is happy to use Shabbos. We have one in the building. We have one in the shul. When the Shabbos lift is first invented, so there are those who come along and say, and there are still those who come along and say, okay, it's not in the spirit of Shabbos. Okay, so everybody can decide. So you say say those words. What does it mean? How do we define it? It's very, very vague. It's very, very unclear. The spirit of Shabbos is the way that Torah works, the way that Halakha works. Is that innovations come into the world. There are new things that come. We don't automatically accept every new innovation because there are things that are against, but we don't automatically reject every new innovation as well. It takes time. It's a gradual process. We have to see, does it fit or does it not fit? There are things that we do which our grandparents did not do and which earlier generations did not do because they didn't have electricity. So they didn't, they had different ways of heating up food. They had different ways of doing things. So the question is, new things come up, we have to examine it. We have to examine it based on all the halachot that we have, based on all the rules and all the principles, etc., and the Rishonim and the Acharonim. That's exactly what we're doing. And then we can decide, okay, although this wasn't done 100 years ago, can we still do it? Does it still fit? Will it still be in the spirit of Shabbat? Sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. But without this, there's no way to know, there's no way to answer that question.
Example of something that was mutter but not in the spirit of Shabbos. Where they came up with the ruling, you're allowed technically, but not for Shabbos.
So electricity is a perfect example. We'll get to that. We'll have a whole series of shiurim on electrical appliances. This is what I said right at the beginning. It's not so, you look at different electronic appliances, it's not so clear what the prohibition is. It's not so clear which melacha it fits into. But there were certain things that Chachmei Yisrael came along and said. Look, Rabbi Weiss has tremendous tshuvot on electricity. Before that, there are many others. Basically, come along and say it's like there was a bat call that said that it's asur. When electricity came out, all the Chachmei Yisrael got together and they basically said intuitively, this is forbidden. There's no way that we can use this on Shabbat. Why? What's the malacha? Okay, now let's argue. We spend the next 100 years arguing and trying to find out what the source is. But it was clear that it's I'm happy to discuss this another time. It's a much broader topic, but that's the beginning. But we will come back to it. Certainly when it comes to electricity, there's no question that's part of the discussion. One thing I'll just say, because it very much speaks to your point, which is we've spoken about before, maybe even last week, I don't remember. But the Ramban in Parshat Kedoshim and the Ramban in Parshat Emor, tremendous piece in the Ramban. The Ramban says that this whole term, the spirit of Shabbos, whatever you want to call it, the Ramban says you could have a situation where you don't transgress a single malacha d'oraita on Shabbat. You don't transgress a single malacha, but you haven't kept Shabbos. You come and he paints this whole picture. The shops are all open, and the people bring their wares, and you come along and you buy on credit. And you do the whole thing, and you're carrying, and you're lifting, and you're exerting, and you do the whole thing. He says you haven't transgressed a single malacha d'oraita, but it's not Shabbat. You've erased the whole call it spirit, call it atmosphere, call it whatever you want. So says the Ramban, that would be an Isur d'oraita. That would be a biblical violation of Shabbat. How so? I haven't done any of the malachot because not Shabbat. Okay. Now who's to decide what is Shabbat and how is Shabbat and what's the thing? So that's up to the Chachamim in every generation to work out based on the klalim and the pratim that we have in the halakha. There's no other way to do it because if it's dependent on what I feel and what I think, so there's somebody who feels that doing this is not Shabbostic. Okay, but if the halakha says it's allowed, it's allowed. All right, so let's go back into Zoreah. We'll get back to all of that in a future shiur. Where were we? Source number 12, the Biur Halacha. So the Biur Halacha says the following. He says, hang on a second. He says, if we say what we've seen until now is the following machloket. We've seen that there are those who say that watering is a problem of planting, and there are those who say that watering is a problem of planting and plowing. Interesting that nobody says the maskana that it's just plow. Now, even if you say, what do we say? We said if we say that it's just a case of that if it's there are no seeds in the ground, you would be allowed, at least according to one of the opinions, you'd be allowed to pour water. But now he says, hang on a moment. He says, Shamashkim kashe. לפי מה שכתב הסמ"ג והובא בגות מימוניות והעתיקו המגן אברהם דמשקה מים חייב משום חורש גם כן. He says, since we've now seen that there are many opinions that say you're liable for the melacha of choresh as well, amai katavte beyayin mutar v'uadin b'shar mashkim she'enan matzmichim. He says, even if you say it's both melachot, but you've said now that if it's not water, but it's other liquids which are not so conducive to the growth of plants, that would be permitted. Even though it doesn't help in terms of planting, nonetheless, it's still a liquid and it's still softening the ground. If we're going now according to the opinion that it's both melachot, so fine, so it's not, and the whole reason you said that if it's not water, but if it's other liquids like wine or urine or whatever, that it's not conducive to planting, nonetheless, you should be chayav for plowing because it's softening the ground. So over the page, top of 304, says the Biur Halacha, he says, Shema yesh lomar, זה לא אמרו בזה משום חורש, רק היחיד הוא מועיל לזרעים גם כן. He says, because plowing is only when it's part of the preparation for planting. אבל היחיד הוא מקלקל לזרעים, but where it's true, I'm softening the ground, and that would be part of plowing, but I'm doing it in such a way that it's going to be detrimental to the seeds. If that is not considered improving the ground, and so he says, I found this in the Mamar Mordechai, which is another one of the Achronim. And nonetheless, he says, so that's an interesting point there by the Biur Halacha. Okay, bottom line, let's look at the Shmat Shabbat Kilchata, source number 14, gives us summarizes some of the halachot of watering plants on Shabbat. He says, Asur lashkot kol tzemach. One may not water a plant, even in an unperforated pot. Any ground which is used for plants or may be used for plants, you cannot pour water on it. Even if there is not currently a plant. Therefore, it's better, says the Shmat Shabbat, like to say for a truma, better not to eat outside. If there's going to be water going around and you're pouring liquids, then it might affect the god. Somebody who does eat in the garden nonetheless, especially if you have your sukkah outside, if you're going to wash outside, you need to do it inside a kli. If you're washing your dishes outside, do it inside a bowl. Don't pour the remnants of your cups onto the ground, right? You're clearing up the table at the end, and there's grass underneath, and you're pouring the water, whatever's left over in the cups. Don't do that. You have a bucket or something outside and it rained. Don't pour that outside. Okay, fine. Let's skip to number 7, which is in bold. He says, what happens if you have a sink? This happens to us, sometimes comes up on summer camps and the like. We had the shayla a couple of years ago. You have a sink, a tap, where the water is flowing, is going through a pipe, and it ends up going onto the ground. So here the case is like this. He says, if water poured into, I'll just read from the English. Water poured into a sink, flows through a pipe to its own ground, washing one's hand into the sink, pouring water into it for any other purpose on Shabbat is permitted. Right? In other words, I think here he's talking more about our sort of pipes and things. You're using the tap, you're pouring into the sink, ultimately it's going through a pipe, and ultimately it's going to go into the ground. He says this is something which is indirect, and one doesn't need to be so concerned about this. ששאריות המים ישפכו לגינה, יכולה להצמיח ישירות ולא דרך צינור. Right? If you have a tap that's in the garden and the water is going straight there, it's not going through pipes, etc., then that's more direct, and that's a problem. Okay, finally, מותר לפתוח ממטרות השקעה וטפטפות מבעוד יום, sprinklers that are turned on before Shabbat, and to leave them open on Shabbat, that is permitted. Okay, that's the machloket we have between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel regarding Shvitat Kelim. Right? If I'm not doing anything on Shabbat itself, if it was before Shabbat that it was turned on and the sprinklers are working by themselves, I have not, according to Beit Shammai, that would be forbidden. But according to Beit Hillel, I have not done anything, and that would be permitted. Okay, so there could be issues of Maradai, and again, it depends. It depends where it is and how it's done, etc. Yeah, but if it's done assuming that it's done in such a way where it's very, very clear that it was turned on before Shabbat, that would be okay. Okay, next topic we have. Let's go on to page 307. Talk about uprooting grass on Shabbat. Again, this is another one. We spoke about this briefly last week. This is another one of the classic sugyot which is discussed in terms of understanding the fundamentals of Eino Mitkaven, etc. The Gemara here has a long discussion in Masechet Eruvin about whether one is allowed to walk on grass on Shabbat and different types of grass, etc. What would be the problem of walking on grass? So we have a melacha of kotzer, which is harvesting or reaping. I'm not allowed to pluck grass from the ground. I'm not allowed to pluck fruit off a tree or pluck branches from a tree, etc. That would be the melacha of kotzer. Right? I remember when we used to go, sometimes we used to go on school trips or whatever, or the Shabbat, and you would have an activity, whatever, you'd be sitting outside on the grass, and everybody's sitting outside, sitting on the floor, and that was in the days before cell phones. What would people do when they were bored? They would pluck the grass, right? So you have to know that is not something that you're allowed to do on Shabbat. But walking, so when one walks on the grass, again, depending on the type of grass, etc., so you may come to uproot it. Bottom line, the Shulchan Aruch says in source number 17, he says, you can walk on grass. It's based on different distinctions that the Gemara makes. That's the point. You are not intending to uproot the grass. And again, so long as it's not inevitable that with every step you will uproot the grass, you can go and you can walk. Now the Mishnah Berurah says, he says, he says, if it's very tall grass, you should not run through it, because he says that is a psik reisha. There, certainly you're going to uproot some of the grass, and therefore you should not walk quickly through that grass as well. The Aruch HaShulchan argues, source number 19, he says, Motar lelech agabei asavim b'Shabbat. He says, you can walk through grass on Shabbat. The only gzera is against using a tree. We'll get to that in a few moments. Lo chayshinan shema del chilucho yidlosh echad min asavim. Don't worry about the fact that you're going to uproot the grass, because it's not certainly going to happen each step you take. and therefore it's Eino Mitkaven, and it's fine. Now he says, En Chiluk, Ben Kshasavim HaUkim Uktzalem, whether it's long grass or short grass, or Ben Olech B'min Al Olech Yachef, you're wearing a shoe or you're not wearing a shoe, or you Ben Olech Kedarkol, Olech B'Mutzah, you're walking normally or you're running. He says, Ha'iti, Misha Machmir B'Olech B'Mutzah, there are those who are stringent when you are running and it's tall grass. He says, but we shouldn't be making up new prohibitions. Okay, so he says that no, I don't think it's a psik reisha that you're going to uproot the grass. It's better to be stringent here, like the Mishnah Berurah. But again, that's only in a very certain case. Bottom line is, walking normally along normal grass is permitted. There is no concern over there. Okay, now that we're walking along the grass and we come to a tree and we see that there's fruit on the tree, are we allowed to smell the fruit? That's the next question. Page 310. As I said, a lot of these halachot come up in the summer. People go out and people are traveling, and you go out for a walk and you come along a nice fruit tree. So the Gemara Masechet Sukkah, source number 21, says the following: Amar Rabbi, Hadas b'mechubar mutar la'alech bo. Okay, the Gemara is talking about the arba minim. So it says something interesting. If you have a hadas, a myrtle branch that is attached to the tree, you're allowed to smell it. But etrog b'mechubar asur la'alech bo. But if you have an etrog which is connected to the tree still, you are not allowed to smell it. Obviously talking about Shabbat or Yom Tov. Why? So it says hadas de la'alech ka yishalit le'eloti lemigzeh. The hadash, all that you can do with it is you can smell, right? We remember the famous midrash about the arba minim. The one has smell and the one has taste. The one has smell and not smell and taste. Right? So hadash just has smell. So you're going to smell it. Okay, you smell it. Big deal. Now that you've smelled it, you're not going to do anything else. We're not concerned you're going to come to pluck it off the tree. Etrog de la achilakai. When it comes to the etrog, comes to fruits, you're going to smell them, but that's only a prelude to eating them. You want to have a nice fruit salad or etrog liqueur or whatever it is. So therefore, you might come along and pluck the etrog off the tree, and that is going to be the melacha of kotzer. So says Shulchan Aruch number 22. It says hadas mechubar mutar la'alech bo, aval etrog v'tapuach v'kol davar ha'ro'i la'achila asur la'alech bo mechubar shema yakutz oto le'ochlo. Any fruit which is attached to the tree that you could eat, you're not allowed to smell it while it's on the tree. We're concerned you're going to come along and pick it. Now, as I mentioned before, every generation and every they have the things that people struggle with. Nowadays, I think people struggle with other things. But apparently, in those days, this was a big thing that people struggled with. Listen to the Mishnah Berurah. Listen to his language. It's fascinating to see when we learn poskim and shutim and Mishnah Berurah, etc. We don't only learn halakha, but we learn history as well. You understand exactly what the poskim were dealing with and what the issues were in those days. So he says like this: you'll say, so if you were worried that after smelling it, you're going to take a bite of it, so maybe you'll take a bite of it while it's still attached to the tree. He says, he says, that doesn't help. That's still forbidden. Now, לכן, יש למחות ביד הטועים והולכים לגינות בשבת ויום טוב וכותבים פירות מן המחובר. Would you believe it, that over 100 years ago, not only did people eat in their gardens, but they went for walks in these gardens on Shabbat, and they would go and they would pick the fruit off the trees. Okay, that's what they would do. And people don't know. That's what he says. He says, To'im. Seemingly, we're not dealing with the evil people, not dealing with people on Mechalel Shabbat on purpose necessarily. But he says you have to protest against those who get this wrong, who make this mistake, and they go to the gardens and they pick the fruit that was attached in order to eat it. V'ochlim milvad yisur u'milvad yisur lisha asurim gam ken achar kach b'achila lachol b'Shabbat. He says not only are they transgressing the prohibition of picking the fruit or harvesting, but we have an issue of Maaseh Shabbat as well. You've gone and you've performed an Isur. That fruit is, no one's allowed to eat from that fruit until after Shabbat either. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this is such a serious problem. We should appoint people. We should go and should supervise in order to stop this from happening. Okay, there were no issues then of people texting on Shabbat or doing other things. They were just going and picking fruits. Every generation with its problems. Okay, So the Shemirat Shabbat summarizes, source number 24. He says regarding flowers, well, summarize, but he says regarding flowers, mutar la'ariach be'prachim kshem be'mechubar la'karka. Okay, flowers you are allowed to smell, but when it comes to smelling fruits, that you cannot, because we're concerned that you may come and pick them to eat. Okay, I think maybe the last topic we'll just mention over here is regarding trees on Shabbat, using trees on Shabbat. We find the Mishnah Masechet Beitza. We're now page 312, source 25. Eluhein mishum shvut. The Mishnah over here lists a number of prohibitions, which are what's called shvut, meaning it's not an Isur Torah, but it's an Isur D'Rabbanan on Shabbat. And one of those is lo alin ba'ilan. One is not climbing a tree. I know you all have to suppress the urge to climb trees every Shabbat, but we'll see that it's not just about climbing the tree, but essentially using the tree, leaning on the tree, taking something off the tree, hanging something on the tree. All of this is going to be forbidden. Source number 26, lo alin ba'ilan. Gzera shema yitlosh. We're concerned that Chamim made a gzera in order to prevent one from detaching the branches from the tree, not to use the tree in any way, shape, or form. If you'll skip just for a moment, fascinating story over here. Again, this is not halacha l'maaseh, but skip to page 332. 332. We have here the machshavas from Rav Rimon's book in Ilchot Shabbat. He brings a story about the stipler. And we'll read the story. It's in source 59. It's on page 332. Just read it in English. He says, Rav Kenigsberg, the stipler, had been forced to serve as a soldier in the Russian army before he moved to Eretz Yisrael. On one Shabbat, it was snowy and intensely cold. The guards were given a special fleece coat to wear with which they could make it through their shift. When the Rav neared the guard post, the previous guard saw him from a distance and left. As he reached the post, he saw the previous guard had left the coat hanging on a tree. As is known, it's forbidden to remove objects from a tree on Shabbat. Rav Yaakov Yisrael, the stipler, decided not to remove the coat. As time passed, it became extremely cold, and the Rav considered again whether to remove the coat from the tree. Removing the tree is only a rabbinic prohibition, as we've just learned. Removing the coat from the tree, right, is only a rabbinic prohibition. So perhaps in this case one may be lenient. But then he thought to himself, I'll wait just 5 minutes. After all, no harm can be done in 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, he was about to remove the coat. He said to himself again, I'll wait another 5 minutes. And in this manner, the entire Shabbat passed, and he did not remove the coat from the tree. Now, he points out here that if it's a case of pikuach nefesh, right, the cold, certainly one would be allowed to violate rabbinic prohibition for that need. But the story shows of Kanievsky's Mesirat Nefesh, and how much certainly we must, all what we can learn from that, is how much we should strive to observe every detail that we can within Ilchot Shabbat. Okay. Interesting, in the footnote it says, it's reported that Judith's incident of Kanievsky became hard of hearing for his entire life. Had he realized that, perhaps he would have removed the coat. Okay. That's again, maybe touched a little bit on our discussion that we had earlier about what's in the spirit of Shabbat and what's not in the spirit of Shabbat and halachot, etc. Okay. But without the extreme circumstances, under normal circumstances, using a tree, relying on a tree, hanging things on it, leaning on it, climbing it, etc., that would be forbidden. That would be forbidden on Shabbat. So, one thing, let's go to page 316. What the Gemara says is that using the tree directly, one could not. The Shulchan Aruch Yan, source number 35, it says, you cannot use the tree, you cannot use the sides of the tree. But if it's one step removed, this is all a rabbinic prohibition to begin with. So the Rabbanan made a gzara, they only made the decree so far. So if it's the sides of the tree, that would be allowed. So for example, have a look at this picture here at the bottom of page 317. A ladder resting on the tree, that is the sides, that one could not climb up. But if you have a ladder resting on a stake, which is attached to the tree, so that's the sides of the sides, that would be allowed. So let's just look at some of the summary of some of these halachot as they come out practically. Source number 36. This is the Orchot Shabbat. This is some, again, it's a contemporary work in Orchot Shabbat. He says like this. Asur laniach b'Shabbat v'yom tov chavetzim al gavei ilan or litlotam b'anafav. On Shabbat, one may not rest items, objects on a tree or on its branches. Asur litol b'Shabbat v'yom tov chavetzim monachim al gavei ilan. You also cannot take off objects that are resting on the tree. Af shenetilat chavetzim me'ilan eina begeder shimush bo. Even though, if I'm taking the objects off the tree, I'm not now using the tree, מכל מקום חששו חכמים שמיטול חפצים ממנו עלול לשען בו. Chachamim said you're going to take objects off the tree, you're going to lean on the tree, you're going to come to use it, and therefore you can't. That's included as well. Min amu nilmad shim nafal beged o kador b'Shabbat al gabei ilan asur lasiro mimeno. So where can this come up? You're playing with a ball or something that falls into a tree. You can't go now, climb up into the tree to get it. Whether you're leaning on the tree or not leaning on the tree, you cannot remove it that fell onto the tree on Shabbat. Chazal said further, don't place your items on the tree before Shabbat, because then on Shabbat you'll come and take them off. Don't hang a towel on the branches of the tree before Shabbat. Okay, important point. It says this is regarding things which you might come to move on Shabbat. You can't hang them on the tree. Things which are muktzah anyway, you can put them on the tree before Shabbat. It doesn't really matter. Again, these halachot are less relevant nowadays in the apartments and the way that we live. But again, when you go on a holiday, you have summer camps, vacations, things, they can, especially if you have young kids, they can come up. Okay, there's what we saw in the picture regarding ladders and something that's connected to the sides of the tree, etc. He goes into that on page 318 as well. All right, so I think we'll stop there for today. Those are some of the halachot related to outdoors on Shabbat. Obviously, there's always more to talk about. Halachot Shabbat is really ma'im she'enaim sof. But with that, we conclude our discussion of volume 19. As I said, this is the last year that we have before the summer break. After the summer break, which we'll let you know in due course when the summer break will conclude, we will continue with volume 20. Be'ezrat Hashem, that's the next book. If anybody wants to purchase the book and take it home, they're more than welcome to do so. Thank you all for coming. Have a good day. Have a good week. Have a good summer. And we'll see you all soon.